Holy shit. That was a prologue? That was a lot of information to take in. Alright. What's up, you motherfuckers? This is Mossy. Hey. Dias Irae, amantes. Bleh, I am a vampire. No, it's a free-to-play visual novel made by Light, I think. It's actually really hard to tell who this is made by. It is made by... Yeah, Light. Developer's name is Light. Lowercase Light. It seems to be very much tied to World War II, the Third Reich, Nazis, and a lot of fantasy lore. Like non-canonical fantasy lore to world history. And the first hour was the prologue. We'll start it now. Okay, now we already know that there are 4 routes. Cool. And I guess main protagonist is a guy. Hopefully I don't have to do a woman's voice. Yay! If only time could just stop. It was impossible to truly determine the single greatest moment of your life until you're looking back on things from your deathbed, of course. But I was sure everyone had wished for something similar at least once. It was only human to wish for a fun time to continue, to want to relive a moment of glory. It felt only human to wish to hang on to the here and now. Even should its brilliance eventually fade, that still beat losing it. The known was comforting, the unknown terrifying. Everyone must have experienced this sort of anxiety before, especially students like me. It was hardly unusual to experience this sort of feeling. After all, we were at the part of our lives where we had to start thinking about college, getting a job, and just the future in general. We were in the uneasy transition period between childhood and adulthood, so it felt only natural that we'd start obsessing with the mundane. One would call it living for the moment, a kind of escapism that arose when you didn't have both feet on the ground. For better or worse, it was the sort of infection that didn't really do anyone harm. You could just write it off as another facet of youth. But I didn't want to ever get over this particular strain of measles myself. After all, my life up to this point had been more than just comfortable. It might have been a bit boring, commonplace one, but I was fine with it continuing the way forever. If time flew when you were just having fun, then the solution was simply not to have fun in the first place. It was the best to steer away from the unknown and stick to the default path. Who knew what sort of trouble you might encounter on the road less traveled by? I was enamored enough by my current environment to actually entertain, more than just entertain in fact, ridiculous notions like that. To turn one's back on the unknown and seek only the known, you could describe it as playing a game while looking at a walkthrough. That was my Ren Fuji's way of life. Always had been, and hopefully always will be. I figured that I could keep my internal sense of time set on slow if I kept this up in this line of thinking. Stopping time completely was impossible after all, so you could consider this philosophy of mine to be a kind of compromise, the closest possible realistic approach. I thought that I understood, that nothing lasted forever, that something being finite meant that its end could come at any time.
じゃあお前、例えば自分の人生を小説だと考えてみろ。
Up until the day where he had to go and say that.
漫画でもゲームでも何でもいいが、とにかく一人称語りで進む長編だ。自分をその主人公だと考えろ。
story that continues from the cradle to the grave, an epic saga that details each and every moment and person that comes into your life from the minute to the monumental. Think of life as something like that, he said.
そこで質問。今自分が綴ってる小説は実際のとこ面白いのか？
Nope.
主人公としてお前はキャラが立ってるのか？
Nope. As far back as I could remember, Shirou has a habit of suddenly going on and on about shit that didn't make sense like this. Most of the time, it was just trying to get a rise out of me.
文法が怪しいとか語彙が貧弱だとかそういうスキルのこと言ってんじゃない。ただドラマとして売りになりそうな花なりトゲなり毒なりを持っているか？さらに同じジャンルを囲った中でも抜きん出ている何かがあるか？自分がやらなくても他の誰かがやるような人生なら生き続ける意味はない。こんなところやそんなところで誰でもできるようなジャンルやっててもしゃあないだろ。連れとだべってバカやって女作ったり部活やったり悪くはないけど珍しくもない。そんなの日本中の同年代がリアルタイムで経験してる。俺は別に数が多いことをバカにしてるわけじゃないぜ。要はそれだけ選びやすい道だってことを言いたいのさ。選択肢があるように見せかけて実は人生一本道なのかもしれないってな。
In other words, what if we're not choosing, but instead being made to choose?
少なくともこの国じゃ最大公約数が強いだろ。出る杭は打たれる、天才は孤独、はぶられるバカ、いじめかっこ悪い。なんでもいいがよ。まあそれは現実的な解釈で理屈つけた場合の話で、俺はなんていうかな。デジャブるんだよ。これ、前にもやったんじゃねえのかなって。楽しくないんだ。新鮮味がない。前にも読んだことある気がするんだ。この話。
With what?
フラグ立てとフラグ折りさ。
And what was that supposed to be?
言ってもわかんねえかもしれねえな。だってお前好きだろそれ。何もかもが基地の範疇、1から10まで同じことを生まれて死ぬまで繰り返したい。そんな変人他に知らんし。そもそも俺の話に出てくるお前はなんかずれてるトリックスターみたいなもんなんだよ。
Could have said the same thing about him myself. Shirou was the sort of guy who was impossible to read, impossible to get a handle on. He certainly wasn't the type of character who should have been appearing in my story. So why did it sometimes feel like he was a central figure in it? If we were going with the whole novel analogy, Shirou was a misprint.
そんなお前をここでどかせば話が変わってくるかもしれない。な顔すんなよ。お前だってわかるだろ。俺らはお互いガキの頃にいろんなもんから弾かれてる。本来なら気楽に学園ドラマやってられるような身分じゃないんだ。そしてだからこそ今までそれをやってきた。挫折もんだよ。泣きたくなる。だから根性なくて悪いけどよ。俺は抜けるぜ。人生は短い。エンディングが来る前に選択肢の総当たりをやらせてくれ。この一本道、絶対どこかに別ルートがあるはずだ。俺はそれを探したい。結果がたとえバッドエンド一直線でも。
If it's something new, then it's worth checking out either way.
だったらここでお前と切れるってのもなかなか面白いと思うだろ。
I had gotten sick of that fucking grin on his face long ago. I finally got that sentence right. It was a sort of expression that seemed to say that he had the nary of a care in the world. Fitting, really. That was how I knew that nothing I said would get through to him. Not like I knew what he was going on about in the first place, really. But one thing for certain, Shirou's genre, or whatever, what was going on, diverged completely from my own.
死んだら化けて出てくれよ。俺まだ幽霊見たことねえし。
So I was prepared for what came next. Fist fights normally can't go too far. After all, you'd be using your actual hands and feet as weapons. If they got fucked up, you're done. It only made sense to call it a draw when you ran out of ammo, so to speak. But Shirou and I were a little too stupid to let something like that stop us. You couldn't even really call it a fight. We were both trying to obliterate each other, plain and simple. There was enough blood pouring down my face to make it seem like I was viewing the world through a red veil. We smacked each other around so much that our hands themselves broke. We even had bones poking out of our skin. But we just kept at it. My eardrums had shattered long ago. I was lost in the world of noise and violence. My shoulder had dislocated itself, my chin was split into two, my ribs were bent and broken, piercing various internal organs for good measure. Here I was hacking up blood like it was going out of style, but Shirou seemed to be having the time of his life. I couldn't focus on anything but the way he exploded with laughter. Why did it end up like this? Why did it need it to take this far?
だから言ってもわかんねえって。ただこの町に住んでいたら。
I couldn't remember what he said after that, no matter how hard I tried. All I knew was that we continued brutalizing each other until our bodies ceased to function. It wasn't a matter of one of us deciding to surrender or passing out or whatever. We just quite literally ran out of batteries. We had both taken too much abuse to keep our bodies going with sheer willpower alone. It was no laughing matter. Our battered bodies were just lying there on the rooftop, drowning in the pool of our own blood. We probably would have died if no one had found us, but what did Shirou say?
楽しいな。
Seriously, how the fuck could he act like that? How the fuck could he act like that was some sort of game? Listen to me, dumbass.
こっちに来たけりゃいつでも言えよ。
Don't act like you triumphed over me, like you've gone to the next level or whatever. Me come at you? Give me a fucking break. You're the one who needs to crawl out of the gutter and come at me, shithead. Left cheekbones, upper cheek jawbone, lower jawbone, right eye fundus, nasal bones, all varying degrees of fractured. Left collarbone, completely fractured. Upper left carpus and middle left hand bones, completely fractured. Right shoulder dislocated. Right ulna, metacarpus, and carpal bones, completely fractured. Ribs number 3 and 4 of the right rib cage, completely fractured. Ribs number 5 and 6 of the right rib cage, compound fractures. Ribs 4 through 6 of the left rib cage, completely fractured. Ribs 7 and 8 of the left rib cage, compound fractures. Right femur partially fractured. Okay, it's just a lot of... In total, I had damaged 48 distinct locations. If you listed it out like that, it sounded like I got into a fight with a dump truck or something. I was surprised I even made it to the hospital in one piece. To be honest though, I would have been okay with dying. It wasn't that I had no regrets, I'd just kind of reached this zen state. Like, if I was going to die, then so be it. Maybe it would have been better to say that I stopped caring. That fight had been enough excitement for one lifetime. I lost the will to do anything, barely paying attention to the world around me. I stopped giving a shit about myself either way. Despite my rather unhealthy mental state, my body recovered quickly enough to shock even the doctors standing around me. More than a little ironic. Honestly, there was a part of me that wanted to laze around in that hospital a little longer, but I suppose there simply weren't enough beds to keep someone fully recovered lying around forever. The hospital staff told me that I needed to get out of there if I was well enough to be walking around. I really had no choice in the matter. I wasn't a fan of the idea of someone who actually needed being turned away because of my selfishness. It was for the best that I compiled with the staff's request. Regardless of my feeling, the world would keep on turning. They said that time stopped for no man after all. No turning back. What was done was done. Right now, the important thing was thinking about what would come next. It didn't matter whether or not I was capable of doing it. I had to face the fact that it was necessary. Period. That was the only thing and way I would ever be able to move forward. So I decided to walk out of there with a smile on the face, one way or another. I headed back to my room to pick up my things after taking care of the checkout procedure. Of course, the only real personal effects I had brought with me were some changes of clothes and an MD player. I had spent 2 months in the hospital room, but I figured cleaning it up would probably only take about 5 minutes. It ended up take about 10, but hey, same difference. The extra 5 minutes were a result of having to clean up all the junk that Kasumi brought in while visiting. They were various comics, novels, and even adult magazines. I seriously don't know what she was thinking with these scattered all over the place, more than a dozen total. Rather than dealing with them myself, I decided to just send them all back to her place.
じゃあ皆さん、お大事に。
That's my voice?
いや、あいつは今頃学校ですよ。来るとうるさくなるんで、一足先に。ってそうですか？変な趣味してますね。
The other patients in the same room made sure to get in a few last light-hearted jabs. I was never good at dealing with situations like this. I doubt anyone would call me a sociable type, but thanks to Kasumi, the other patients would often strike up conversations with me. It would be awkward just to ignore them completely after all. My responses were always half-assed, but they didn't seem to mind. Hospitals generally had a gloomy atmosphere about them, so it was only natural that someone cheery like Kasumi would draw attention.
ならあいつの進路に看護師って選択も入れるように言っときますよ。
I tucked my bag and turned to leave, but at the same moment,
シローですか？
Shirou, being just as messed up as I was, had also been taken to this hospital. The bastard disappeared 3 days after his surgery and hadn't been seen since.
知らないですね。あいつがどこで何してようと、俺には関係ありませんよ。
Yeah, exactly. What Shirou was up to was none of my business. I needed to stop worrying about his bullshit.
じゃあ
I stepped out of the hospital room, putting it all behind me once and for all. It had been months since I had last been outside the hospital. The vast blue open sky spread out invitingly above me. In 2 months I had been hospitalized. Autumn had turned to winter. I suddenly became curious as to whether they were already putting Christmas decorations downtown.
まあ遠回りなわけでもないし。
I decided that it might be fun to experience my own version of the whole Rip Van Winkle experience. I needed a change of space from the dull scenery I'd been stuck staring at from the hospital window anyway. Maybe this would help me get back into the swing of things.
って思ってたんだけどな。
Unfortunately, even downtown there was but the barest trace of Christmas spirit I had been expecting. It made me realize again just how laid back Suwahara City really was. Suwahara was built back when around the time of World War II. Oh, what a coincidence! Despite being in an isolated location, it was nevertheless fairly prosperous thanks to efforts on the part of the big shots in charge of the place. What Suwahara lacked in history and tradition and made up for its tourist attractions, there were any number of facilities to draw in crowds with, such as an amusement park that was famous nationwide. You could call it a small town success story. Of course, I only moved here 2 years ago myself, so I wasn't really one to talk. I was definitely a fan of the landscape and general atmosphere of the city though. It seemed like a hectic place at first glance, but things moved slower in Suwahara than one might think. Once you got used to it, it was as as a baby's cradle. Of course, most people would tell you the most... I think I'm getting tired now. Of course, most people would tell you the exact opposite, that Suihara was a lively place with a bustling atmosphere, but I did know a few other people who agreed with my assessment, such as Himuro and Shirou. It wasn't like you could really say that either line of thinking was right or wrong, though I didn't feel like trying to argue with people who disagreed. Live and let live, I guess. Anyway, my first foray into the city in 2 months didn't end up changing my impression of it much.
帰るか。
Guess we'll go home. In the end, I just came to the boring conclusion that it was the same city as ever. Right as I was about to head back,